The F-35 was born of an exceptionally dumb kind of piece of Air Force PR spin. The mission of the airplane was to be half of what the Air Force called the high-low mix. It was supposed to be one super expensive, supposedly super capable fighter, the F-22, and then a cheaper fighter of which you were supposed to be able to buy a lot that would do everything else.
That was
Beyond
the
air-to-air, and that was the F-35. That whole high-low mix idea was an Air Force PR concoction to make up an excuse. This was actually from the 70s. Can you believe this? It shows you how long dumb ideas persist. It was in the 70s, the Air Force, the apple of its eye was the F-15, a two-engine, great big fighter for its day, close to 50,000 pounds, super big radar, all the bells and whistles that the Air Force could think of, which was exactly what they wanted, big, expensive airplane. Colonel Boyd and I and Colonel Riccioni had worked on it, had gotten disgusted with it because it had gotten too loaded up with junk. And so we went off and, as kind of bureaucratic guerrillas, and underground started the F-16.
Which was, by comparison, what?
Which was going to be less than half the size, half the cost, and much hotter. It was going to just wax the F-15 by virtue of being smaller and hotter and designed specifically for that mission and not designed to carry a bunch of junk, a bunch of complex electronic stuff that had no relevance to combat.
You've called the F-35 a turkey.
Absolutely. It is a turkey. It's inherently a terrible airplane because it's an airplane built for a dumb idea. As soon as you go to design a multi-mission airplane, you're sunk. As soon as you try to make the airplane do close support, air-to-air, deep interdiction bombing, and to carry a whole long laundry list of technologies as long as my arm, you're sunk. You'll never get a good airplane out of that. You'll get a kludge, that will fail, time and time again. And even worse, it's a three-service airplane, which means now you have three bureaucracies squabbling over the specifications. You have the Air Force, the Marines, and the Navy, and each of them wants something totally different. And then you have the pretense that somehow you can fold all this into one airframe and make it work for three different services. What's happened is you've compromised the airplane horribly for three different missions, and you've compromised it even worse for three different services. So just as an example, the Marines have this, mindless passion now, recently, for vertical takeoff airplanes, ever since they got the British Harrier. Well, that makes the airplane very fat because you have to have a lift fan in the center of the airplane to blow air vertically, to make it take off vertically or land vertically. So now you have a great big fat center section. Now you have too much drag. It turned out they put on tiny wings, which helps it to take off vertically, but means it can't maneuver in combat. You need wings to create lift to turn. No wing, no turn. And so the airplane is astonishingly unmaneuverable, because it has to carry 108 pounds of airplane per square foot of wing.
So in air-to-air combat, in dogfights?
In dogfighting, it's hopeless. You can guarantee that a 1950s designed MiG-21 or French Mirage would just hopelessly whip the F-35.
So if the F-35 is not a fine combat plane, what about as support for troops, air support?
That's the most laughable of all, because to support troops, you have to be able to get in close, to maneuver, to find really difficult to find camouflage targets. You have to be able to turn at quite slow speed. You have to carry a large gun, say like the A-10, and you have to be able to stay in the vicinity of the troops for 4 to 6 hours. You have to be able to loiter in order to really give them all-day cover when they need it.
And
this is hopelessly impossible with the F-35.
Why?
The F-35 uses far too much gas. It's lucky if it can hang around for an hour or an hour and a half at most. the maneuverability is laughable. You know, you couldn't possibly get down in the weeds, as the pilots say, with this airplane and turn in time to see a tank. You know, remember, a tank is not visible from even maybe from a quarter mile or less. This airplane, at the speeds at which it has to go, because of the tiny wings, remember, it can't maneuver, so it can't fly slow, and nor should it in combat, because it's so vulnerable.
So what is it good at?
It's not good at anything.
What about
It's
as a bomber?
It's a terrible bomber. So it's a terrible bomber, and by the way, because of stealth, it's designed really to carry the weapons internally, right? You can't hang weapons under the wing and still be invisible to radar. So the whole thing, that's another thing, by the way, that makes it fatter and more drag and more fuel consumption and less maneuverable. So you can put 2 big bombs inside this thing, you know, which is a ridiculous payload, you know, for most conventional war.
So, well, talk to me then about the stealth. I mean, how stealth capable is the F-35?
Well, the first thing to know about stealth is that it's a scam. You know, it simply doesn't work. You know, radars that were built in 1942 could detect every stealth airplane in the world today. The Battle of Britain radars, not because there was anything great about them, but because they happened to have very long wavelength. So every Battle of Britain radar would see the F-35 and the F-22 and the B-2. You know? Now, I'm not talking here as an antiquarian, because unfortunately the Russians picked up on this and have been building exactly those radars ever since World War II. They never stopped building low-frequency, long-wavelength radars. And they've modernized them to an extraordinary extent. They build some really amazing mobile versions of them now that are both hard to find when they're camouflaged and can be erected in 40 minutes and see every stealth airplane in the world. And they sell them to anybody who's got cash.
So you're telling me it's a bad airplane, it can't do dogfights, it can't protect troops on the ground, it's a lousy bomber, and despite everything that the manufacturer's saying, it's not stealth.
Correct.
So what is
You
the
are
point
exactly correct.
So what is the point of this plane?
The point is to spend money. That is the mission of the airplane, is for the U.S. Congress to send money to Lockheed. That's the real mission of the airplane. And I guarantee you, by the time all the failings of the F-35 have come to light, you know, if Canada is still buying it, they'll be paying $200 million plus.
$200 million plus.
Plus. Because among other things, of course, the quantity, the promised quantity will never happen.
Right.
You know, nations will drop out. Lots of people won't have the money to pay for it, both abroad, and the U.S. is going to keep on cutting back the buy. As the buy cuts back, the cost will go up and up. I'm predicting that in the U.S. we'll probably never buy more than 500 airplanes. That means the cost of the F-35 in the U.S. will shoot up beyond 300 million, maybe 350 million.
If there had been a real competition in 2010 before Canada made its decision, how do you think the F-35 would have held up?
If it was a straight-up competition with reasonably well-defined mission goals and so on, I suspect one of the European fighters would have won. Not that they're very good, you know, just they're not as bad as the F-35, you know. The Gripen or the Eurofighter or whatever, as they have won in other countries where they have had competitions, I think it would be hands down that the F-35 would lose on a whole bunch of grounds, on cost grounds, on reliability grounds, on performance grounds, on all of it. But the hooker would be that the people who are doing the evaluation, who are doing the competition, have to understand about stealth and the fact that it's a very shaky business, that it's a scam. One
of the reasons that the Department of Defense has given for why it has sole sourced this was because it was the only fifth generation plane available.
Well, first of all, fifth generation is another silly, you know, mindless cliche. It doesn't mean anything. Of course they use stealth as the excuse for sole source, you know, without evaluating at all the question of does stealth work? You know, what are people likely to do who are facing stealth airplanes? What did the Yugoslavs do? How did the Yugoslavs shoot down the F-117? They were well aware that they were being invaded by stealthy airplanes, and they figured out how to shoot it down. And that's what everybody's going to do who thinks they might be bombed by a stealthy airplane. So any real evaluation would have to start there. Mm-hmm. If you do that, you realize that the stealth is a very thin reed, and certainly not an excuse for a sole source.